Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard and this is Lap of the World. Today we're going to be dealing with yet another wheel bearing on our 1992 NSX. If you've been following that saga. Fortunately, this one seems to have worn out in the more normal lifespan than the several that preceded it. Long story for another day. But we are starting at the point in this video where you've already gotten the hub and bearing assembly off the car. We have covered that process previously on the channel. Somewhere up in a corner, and in the description down below I'll include that link. But we are starting today from the point that you have the wheel bearing and hub assembly off the car, and we're going to cover the process specifically for a rear wheel bearing of removing an old bearing and putting a new bearing back on the hub. My fellow NSX DIYer Chris Lum has done a similar video for the front wheel bearing. The rear wheel bearing, after I got stuck into it, felt different enough to warrant its own video, so here we are. But with all of that said, we will start with our assembly off the car and jump right in. To replace an old wheel bearing in addition to a new wheel bearing, you'll need the following tools and supplies. Some basic hand tools, sockets, and ratchets, a 5 to 6 inch bearing splitter, a large-ish multi-jaw gear puller, a cutoff wheel or angle grinder, various diameter press sleeves, and at least a small hydraulic press. Removing the old bearings begins on the workbench as we set up our gear puller with a large socket serving as a drift, with a ball joint kit cup as a bearing surface for the puller screw. We then position what was probably a too small gear puller and hand tighten the screw. Moving this assembly to the vise, I use some sacrificial lug nuts to protect the studs while still affording some twist resistance as I use the gear puller to remove the bearing housing with most of the bearing itself. This does leave the lower inner race behind, which is what we have to deal with next. The service manual is very optimistic with its diagram of how this should happen. In reality, there is no appreciable gap into which one might fit a pulling tool between the bearing race and the hub itself. Taking a note from Chris, who also ran into this issue, I used a wheel to cut some notches into the race to give the bearing splitter some purchase. I then assembled the bearing splitter and started to try and pull the inner race off the hub. This did not go to plan. The tension required to budge the race ended up compromising the thin part of the metal where I'd cut my notches, which led to some enthusiastic decompression events. Fortunately, in spite of failing to remove it entirely, the bearing splitter did manage to create enough of a gap for my gear puller to be able to finish the job. The issue here is the size of the splitter versus the outer diameter of this bearing race. With the nuts flush on the splitter, you can see no threads exposed if I try to put the splitter on the thickest part of the bearing race. This size splitter works for the slightly smaller front bearings, but not the rears. I'd recommend at least a 5 or 6 inch bearing splitter for the rear, using the same notching technique, but on the thicker end of the race. Installing a new bearing for me began with a little bit of a side quest to assemble an early birthday present in the form of an inexpensive shop press. I'm not really aware of a good workaround for not having a hydraulic press to refit one of this type of wheel bearing. As it is at the usual source for cheap tools, this didn't cost much more than what a shop might have charged me to swap the bearing once, so I'll call it an investment in the next few times I do this. Setting the new bearing up to be pressed on warrants some thought and planning. You want to support the hub face with something other than the also pressed in lug studs, notably something that can hold up to a few tons of pressure. On the bearing side, you'll want to make sure that you're only applying pressure to the top inner race. Putting pressure elsewhere will result in dynamic disassembly of your new bearing and another trip to the parts store. Honda sells special tools for this, but you can also make do with any press sleeves of appropriate inner and outer diameter that you have on hand. With the press put together and my stack of implements in place, I spritzed the hub shaft with some lube and was then able to press the new bearing into place. So I hope you found the video informative, if not entertaining. This was a little bit more of a process than I bargained for, but I am pleased that going forward, it's something that I will be able to do 100% in my own garage, rather than needing to, wait for a shop to open or ask favors on the other side of town or whatever the case may be. If I need to get this done, late on a Sunday evening before I depart for a trip on a Monday morning, I can get the whole job done now in my own facility, which is nice. But having said that, again, hopefully you found the video useful, and maybe it inspires you to tackle this yourself, or maybe it's talked you out of it. In either case, my job here is done, literally and figuratively. Thanks again for watching. I'm Richard. This is Lap of the World. We will see you guys all in the next video, if not at the track.